The questions, though, we are debating on Budget Bash-Up is whether it fundamentally changes the course of Indian economy. Has the budget been truly transformational? The Minister of State for Finance and one of the chief architects of this budget, Jayant Sinha, has been kind enough to take on the tough questions from a very tough panel here. Our very own Maithili Busnurmat, consulting editor, Professor Abhijit Sen, member of the 14th Finance Commission, and of course the dissenter in that panel, Amy Kazmid from Financial Times and Douglas Usman from the Reuters. Thanks very much each one of you for being with us. Thanks Mr. Sinha for consenting to do the bash-up as it will. Let me just start with the uncomfortable questions. And the uncomfortable question that our panel believes here is that the budget arithmetic doesn't quite add up. I'm going to throw this to Maithili to take it forward from here.
Mr. Sinha, initially the first few days, the budget was very well received. But over the past 1 or 2 days, we've been seeing a lot of voices, questioning the arithmetic behind the budget. In fact, one paper called it a sentiment success because the stock market initially ran up. Of course, it's been volatile since. But if you look at the budget arithmetic, particularly gross tax revenue, expenditure, what is clearly evident is that the gross tax revenues have been hugely overestimated. As a very optimistic estimates, and expenditure fairly conservative, particularly if you look at where the government is at the end of January. You'd already exceeded your fiscal deficit target for the current year by as much as 37,000 crores. So what credibility do these numbers really have?
No, I think the numbers are actually quite credible, Maithili, and it's, I think, a wonderful exercise when everybody gets into the numbers in detail and goes through them, and that really is the way of transparency and accountability, which we, of course, fully subscribe to. What we've tried to do on the revenue side is to use, I think, fairly conservative estimates because, our sense of nominal GDP growth next year is 11%. As you know, we are expecting GDP growth rate real of between 8.1% to 8.5%. We think the GDP deflator is going to be another couple, 2-3% there. And so that's the 11%. Now, how we get to 14%, the 3% extra from the 11% GDP growth rate, nominal GDP growth rate, is through excise taxes. Now, this year, we had only about 3 to 4 months of excise taxes on fuel, and we mopped up 20,000 crores. So our expectation is that when we do this for the full year, provided oil stays at the price levels that it's at right now, we will in fact be able to raise another 60, 70, 80,000 crores depending on where oil prices are. And that's the additional amount from the 11% to the 14% is due to a full year of excise taxes that we'll be getting from fuel. And that's how we get to the 14% on the revenue side. As far as expenditure is concerned, you know that the plan expenditure this year was estimated to be 5.75 lakh crores. Actually, what we spent was more like 4.6 lakhs crores. Some of it was indeed because, we were prudent in terms of fiscal management and we cut back in certain areas. Some of it is just simply that as we are stepping up expenditure in many different government programs and so on, it takes time to build up capacity. It takes time to put that money to work. And so being conservative on the expenditure side actually does reflect the ground realities of stepping up some of these government programs. So all in all, I think the 3.9% fiscal deficit number is in fact a fairly credible number. And I think that's been appreciated both by analysts, by the markets, and certainly by the Reserve Bank of India as well.
But it's based on the assumption that A, oil prices will remain where they are, number one, and number two, 11.4 nominal growth is what you had last year also. So with the same nominal growth, you're assuming much higher tax buoyancy. Why is that?
Well, we are not assuming any tax buoyancy at all, because if we are getting nominal GDP growth of 11%, and we have that 11% plus the fuel excise taxes that we did not have last year, the 14% becomes a very credible number as a result of that. So there's no tax buoyancy at all in the numbers. In fact, that is something that could be a bonus for us. But we've not assumed any tax buoyancy. Usually when the economy starts to grow faster, you do in fact see some tax buoyancy, but we've not assumed that to make the estimates conservative. So that is not being done. The 11%, like I said, this is based on the CSO number where we've got 7.4% GDP growth this fiscal year. Everybody is expecting, and we are expecting as well, the GDP growth rate will go up by at least a percentage point. That brings us to, let's say, 8.4 or so. And the deflator is running at 2 to 2.5%. So the 11% again is a very reasonable number.
We'll come to GDP growth figures in just a bit, but just to take a cue from the oil discussion we were having, and Amy and Doug, both of you believe this is a budget bailed out by oil?
It does seem that the government has gotten particularly lucky. its tenure is coinciding with an all-time low in recent decades of global oil prices. But how much are you taking a risk in just betting that those low oil prices will continue for the whole next year? And what would be the plan in case there is some kind of shock that sends prices rising again? Is there some kind of backup plan? Will you remove some of those excise taxes that you've imposed on fuel? And how much would that throw the numbers out of whack? I mean, what's the kind of flexibility that you have?
That's a very good question.
Because it's a volatile region.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right, Amy. That's a very good question. We've certainly spent a lot of time thinking about that and worrying about it. As of now, our thinking is that oil is going to be in that $50 to $80 band, which will, keep the numbers kind of in the range that they are right now. It won't be a shock if it stays within that $50 to $80 band. Everything that we've seen, the consensus estimate, the ranges that people have for oil prices are certainly in that $50 to $80 band. So we think, that's a relatively sensible kind of range to expect oil prices to be in. Now, of course, we all recognize we live in an uncertain, volatile world, and there are a number of risks. If oil prices were to spike, for instance, if there is some exogenous event that no one is predicting right now, but those things happen, the black swans happen, of course, quite regularly. If that were to be the case, the contingency plan then is that because we will not necessarily pass through all of that to consumers, that we will start to take off some of these excise taxes. As we start taking off some of those excise taxes, obviously there will be pressure again on the fisc, and that's where we will have to do some dynamic adjustment as we go along to see what we can do over there. But that, of course, this year, for instance, we also demonstrated our ability to dynamically manage the situation as we went along, because we recognized that there was going to be a revenue shortfall of 1 lakh crore as we got into it relative to the budget estimates. And so we manage a 1 lakh crore hole in the budget between the excise taxes that we raised along the way, the excise taxes that we removed from motor vehicles, and in terms of expenditure compression. So you expect any government to be able to manage these kinds of situations, which is what we were able to do last year, and I think we have confidence we'll be able to do this year as well.
Can I just ask a follow-up to that? I mean, the low global oil prices made it very easy for the government to then remove subsidies on petrol products at the pump. Do you think that commitment to ensuring that there would be no subsidies of petroleum products for cars and vehicles at the pump would hold if there was an oil price hike?
No, those are obviously important issues to work through. Obviously, we want to go to market-linked prices, and we have certainly moved in that direction, and we are going to, I think, stay the course on that. If there is a massive spike, for instance, which will have very inflationary consequences, obviously we have to think about that very carefully, because inflation is something we really want to be able to manage, because that immediately and directly impacts the poor. And as the Prime Minister said, this is very much a government that's dedicated to the poor, and it's not just a question of political necessity to do that. We think that is our moral responsibility, and I think all of us in India recognize that it's very important to make sure that the vulnerable and weaker sections of society are protected.
We'll put that budget to the equity and the inequality test in just a bit, but Doug, we were talking about the subsidy rationalization. You don't seem to be too impressed about the budget not taking that forward. You want to put off that question?
Yeah, I think you've had a windfall on the energy side, right? But other subsidy spending is poorly targeted and frankly wasteful. And meanwhile, health, education looks like it's coming up short. So when could we expect to see a more meaningful transition to good quality spending that will help the poor?
On this particular issue of subsidy reform, some of the criticism that I've seen in the budget has been there, particularly in the global press. What I've heard is, oh, these are very wasteful subsidies. Why aren't you immediately taking an axe to them? That's kind of the coverage that I've heard. But you have to understand India's political economy and the needs of the poor as well. First and foremost, under any circumstances, as I've said, any circumstances, there is no way that we are going to curtail, what is needed for the poor and the deprived. So we have, So let me finish, right? Which is that, so it's entirely possible that yes, the 2/3 do require that, and if we find, but I'll tell you how we will manage that, which is what we're doing on the LPG cylinders as well, for instance, which is that we have to maintain subsidy levels. We have to maintain subsidy levels, and we have to ensure a basic safety net for everybody in this country. Again, as I said, that's our moral responsibility, our Raj Dharm, if you will. So with that being the case, so the desire to maintain those subsidy levels and to be a just and compassionate government, of course, which we have to be, we have to therefore make sure that nobody's deprived of something that they would like to have, while at the same time marching steadily down a path where we are ensuring that it's the right beneficiaries, the targeting of the beneficiaries, number one. Number two, that there is no leakage along the way. And number three, that there are caps on how much people are going to use. That is exactly the approach we've demonstrated as far as the LPG gas cylinder is concerned, where we are now running the world's largest direct benefits transfer program, which includes 11 crore people. We have a cap, 12 cylinders. We have targeted beneficiaries, and we are eliminating some of the leakage in the grey market and everything else that was operating there. That's precisely the approach we can now follow in the other areas like in PDS. And even as we are doing that, we are encouraging a great deal of experimentation and different approaches from the state governments themselves as part of our thinking around cooperative federalism. So that's how we are tackling subsidies. So everybody is protected, everybody gets what they require. In the gas cylinder thing right now, we are saying, look, if you're at a certain income level, please don't avail yourself of the subsidy. Don't sign up to have it coming into your bank account. Self-select and move out of this kind of a subsidy regime.
Why don't we just withdraw it for income taxpayers instead of asking people, depending on the goodness of people, which is very suspect? Why don't we just withdraw it?
No, so you have to. The other thing you have to understand, as I said, this is a very sensitive matter in the political economy. We want to be able to deal with it in a just and compassionate way, and so, as you deal with these subsidies, you have to do it in a graduated way. You have to do it in a way that you ensure that nobody is being hurt, and as and when you can withdraw it, you withdraw it, like we've done with was done previously with the gas cylinders. And I think in an approach that was sensible, and they deserve full credit for it, for the UPA government on the issue of fuel subsidies, where over a long period of time, through a series of gradual increases, they were brought to market levels. That's the sensible approach in a democracy to get people to adjust to that. I can assure you, to my colleagues who are not Indians, that if you were to try and cut back subsidies, whether it's in the US, whether it's in the UK or in France, where the farmers are going to be out in the streets, and this is the way it works in a democracy. People are used to a certain level of support. They think it's the prerogative to achieve that support.
That's why we gave you 282 seats, sir.
But that's why we are moving forward so quickly when it comes to Aadhaar, which the previous government had, but for whatever reason did not move forward as quickly. They certainly did not have something like Jan Dhan Yojana. They certainly had not implemented.
I think the one subsidy a lot of people had thought government would act on, which is urea, which is not capped, there is no real base to target it with. Nothing's really happened there, and that's the one which is actually having huge impact in the nutrient ratios. Was there any thinking about it, or was it business as usual? We can't do much.
Professor Sen, the truth of the matter is we have spent months and months and months trying to understand what is the best way to deal with the urea subsidy, and there were many discussions and consultations on that matter. What we've not, and again our approach is to be able to make sure that we're doing it in an efficient, streamlined manner in all the different areas of subsidies. Of course, on petrol and diesel, we've already moved on that. We are moving on PEHEL, which is the gas cylinders. We are working on PDS, and we are going to then do kerosene, and we're going to figure out what we do on urea as well. But it has to be done in a way, you have to understand the government's ability to implement and get things done in a way that is protective of the people who need it, while at the same time making sure that you're doing it as efficiently and as effectively as possible.
Many of us here believe that the 282 gives you enough elbow room to do it efficiently and quickly. We're just going to talk about the leveraging 282. But Professor Sen, I will bring this debate to the other focus of the budget arithmetic, and that, of course, is the Finance Commission report that you've been a dissenter on. First, why dissent on the devolution to the states, and what's the rationale there? And Maithili, I would also want to bring this to you, because many people believe planned expenditure has been cut because so much is going to the states. That doesn't really cut ice with you. So I'll go with Professor Sen and then come.
Well, if you ask why my dissent?
Yes.
No, as a commission, we awarded 42% of the tax, the divisible taxes. My dissent was limited just to the following: that start with 38 and then discuss it with the states and move to 42 once that discussion is over. That was my dissent. The reason, because I realized what would happen in the budget. You would have to make large cuts if you accepted it. Those cuts would have to be absorbed, and they would be absorbed mainly on items which are going to the states through the planned schemes.
That's right.
And that is precisely what has happened. The issue really is that in making those cuts, certain things have been hit harder than other things. The block grants from the Ministry of Finance have all gone. The block grants roughly 40% of these used to go to the so-called special category
Right.
states. They've suffered that sort of a hit on that, and the devolution gives them about 10 to 11%.
Right.
So they really have taken a much larger hit on this. So my issues were, there were issues there which needed to be settled. The government would have to cut. But let me take up something slightly different but related to that, which is that what has really happened on the set of plan schemes which the central government says will be fully financed are by and large at best the same as 2014-15 BE. In many cases, less than that. So the fully financed means that we're not going to give anything in more in real terms to health, education, and they're actually taking a cut in real terms, even if the states were to actually make up for many of these. And I think that's the issue a lot of other people are.
Right. I know Maitri is very upset about the cut in plan expenditure.
But no, I do have another question, which is, some of us are wondering about one thing, tucked away in the budget arithmetics as a central sector expenditure, but for the purposes of loans and grants to the states, is 20,000 crores to the Department of Economic Affairs, that's your ministry, to be used by NITI, for NITI to actually use.
Right.
Now, that sounds a lot like the old Planning Commission.
I have another segment on the Planning Commission and the NITI Aayog, but Maitri, I will just quickly take you on plan expenditure, ask him that and then move on further.
Mr. Sinha, my problem really was not with the tax devolution, which I think the government claimed was one of the big pluses of this budget, because frankly, precedent went against you. We just had to accept the Finance Commission recommendations.
I might want to interrupt you on that. You see, this notion of cooperative federalism is something that's in our manifesto. We've consistently said that this is what we want to do. The very fact that even prior to getting the report of the 14th Finance Commission, we had already restructured the Planning Commission to NITI Aayog, already was signaling that we were moving to a very different approach. And you have to also remember, and Professor Sen is here, and he will tell you, I'm sure, that there is an understanding between government and the Finance Commission. No Finance Commission's recommendations have ever not been implemented by the government. So no. So the Finance Commission also knows that they will only, particularly if they're doing something this radical, that it is fitting in with the government's priorities and philosophy. Professor Sen will tell you, which is why they are then emboldened to actually make a recommendation of this kind. And so there is that implicit, tacit understanding between the Finance Commission and the government that we are both on the same page. And so I think you have to give us some credit for resetting the fiscal architecture of the Indian government and accepting that and working towards that. And I'll explain one more thing, which is that even after the recommendation came in, we had many degrees of freedom around how we would accept it. Professor Sen had a dissent note and so on. So there were ways in which we could have softened the blow, we could have done certain things, we could have postponed it. But because it was very much aligned with our own philosophy and our own thinking, we said, absolutely, let's embrace this by all means. And I was part of all of those debates, point one. Point two, I want you all to understand one very important thing. One very important thing, which is that between GST, which is fundamentally changing the taxing power of the state and local governments as well as the center, and what has happened through the devolution to the states, and Professor Sen has the long history and the long understanding of how this is done. We've transformed the fiscal architecture of the Indian government. Now, people say, is this a big bang budget? Is this a wow budget? What's happening? I will submit, this is my honest submission. You all are experts. You all can also come to your conclusions that in some ways this is as revolutionary and as profound as what happened in 1991, because you're changing fundamentally the manner in which the Indian government works. And I can assure you all that if something was like this was happening in London or Washington, and you went to the central ministries there and said you're going to lose 15-20% of your budget, I'm not sure that Washington or London or Paris could absorb it. But and you talk about the 282, this is where the 282 comes into
what I will certainly concede is that what you did very radically is removing the tied and the untied part. So the flexibility that you are given to the states now is truly remarkable. But in terms of total transfers, the number hasn't changed very significantly. It's more or less the same. Earlier the center gave it to you and told you what to do. Today the center is saying, we're giving it to you and you do what you want. So in terms of total transfers, there's virtually no difference difference.
So, that
is not so radical.
We are working through, we are working.
So let me just complete.
Please go
The radical part is in allowing them freedom, number one. So the credit, yes, to that extent, you do deserve credit, but the Finance Commission recommendations are broadly accepted. So it has been very, very difficult for you to go against it, number one. Number two, even having said that you're devolving more to the states, but what you've done, some of your taxes have become cesses. Now, cesses are not shared with the states. So having said that we want to give more to the states, on the contrary, your action has not quite suited your words. Agreed, it's not a large amount, and what you have done by way of untied transfer is truly remarkable. I concede that entirely. But you haven't gone the full length. That is what I would say.
Let me actually disagree a little bit, and I think
and
a little bit with Jayant as well. I think the Finance Commission shouldn't be said that, you know, we worked it out with the government to be what a final recommendation was. It was our recommendation. It was a recommendation which took into account the fact that government was already spending a certain amount, and we wanted to make a lot more of that untied.
Yes.
We had a slight division on could it be done immediately without creating too much of a problem, but that's a minor problem. And government has accepted it. The issue really is, and cesses and things are things which government will do. I mean, they will have to, you know, do a little bit
but those cesses that are sort of statutory things, you have to accept them. They're in the law. So, for example, the cess for the roads and the cess for Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan is a given. You know, we have to accept it.
No, those cesses don't get shared, and in the Finance Commission, we didn't say the cesses ought to be shared. That's a constitutional position. No, I think really where some issues still remain is one, of course, what I said, what is going to be the role of the Niti Aayog now on this? There will be certain things which have to be sorted out. There are certain things we didn't do. Andhra Pradesh wants a capital, which we didn't provide for. They want you to provide it. There are all those things.
Right.
And there is this big issue regarding, you know, somewhere along the line, the Planning Commission roles have to come back to some extent through the Niti Aayog, and there has to be a mentoring role of the Niti Aayog on the states. Because a lot of people are asking, you've cut health, you've cut education, you've cut agriculture, expecting states to pick them up. How are we going to know that that happens? Although I'm absolutely on the card that we did the right thing, and I'm with you, that this is a giant change for India.
I thought this was a mashup, but he's with you on
this.
It's
a mashup. It's not a mashup. It's a mashup.
It's a mashup of stuff. But I'm going to move this discussion to something that all of us were obsessed with before the budget was presented, and that is, of course, fiscal deficit. Maitree, for instance, believes you've been pragmatic in letting the deficit expand. You've been pragmatic to let the 3.6 be 3.9, defer the 3% by a year. Raghuram Rajan may have been convinced, and he's gone ahead and cut rates, but let me quickly quote what Fitch is saying here. Fitch says the medium-term fiscal consolidation strategy is less aspiring than in the past, which is negative from a sovereign rating perspective. We've got two international voices here. Before I go to them, what's your reply to this?
Well, obviously, every time you're dealing with these kinds of trade-offs, you have to take into account, you know, what are the costs and the benefits on either side of the trade-off. And as far as our thinking was concerned, we genuinely felt that we could easily achieve the 3.6, thanks, of course, to the windfall in oil prices, which we happily acknowledge. But our sense was that because the economy, particularly on the public investment side, had been so chronically starved, we all know that capital expenditure as a percent of our overall fiscal spend have come down. There are areas like the railways, for instance, which have been, you know, very starved of investment for the last decade or so. And as a result of that, because of this lack of public investment, there was in fact a range of projects, a full list of projects with very high both economic and social returns that were available. And so for us, what really tipped it on the margin was the fact that you could take this additional 37,500 crores, that is the 0.3% of GDP, you take that 37,500 crores and you apply it to things like electrification of railway lines, things like, you know, where you can spend it on irrigation projects and so on, where again the economic returns, the social returns are just fabulous, and the multiplier effect in the economy is really, really good. So we thought, given how much the need was for public investment, that this was the right trade-off. And then there is that's the static view. There's a dynamic view as well, which is that if we can get through this public investment spending, the investment cycle moving again, then, you know, you crowd in private investment, and then we really get the investment cycle turned around, and and that really puts us on the path of high growth. So again, you kind of think through all of the pluses and minuses, you look at the trade-off, and then you come out in this way.
Do you want to comment on that, on the fiscal deficit and the... Yes.
Well, I think you know, the government has a pretty precarious fiscal situation, right? I mean, it just has a very narrow revenue base, and it hasn't got a lot of money to play with. I can understand you want to redirect investment, but how do you see the transmission happening, that you know, the private sector will come in? It doesn't seem to me that India has done enough to make infrastructure projects really financeable and attractive.
No, so I think Maitri has a point there. Why don't you take two questions together? Yes.
I would have bought your argument entirely. In fact, I was one of the votaries who was saying having a slightly more relaxed fiscal deficit target. But unfortunately, the quality of the fiscal deficit, your ratio of revenue deficit to fiscal deficit, has deteriorated. And in fact, the effective revenue deficit, which is a more telling one number, has gone up from 45% to 51%. So if only the space that you have got by the slightly more relaxed target had been used entirely, it would have been reflected in your revenue deficit to fiscal deficit.
No, I'm not sure, Maitri. Let me explain you three different questions. But let me
just add a little bit.
No, let me do three, because I can only handle three questions at a time. I can't do four. Can't keep them all in my head. But let me address them in reverse order, and Maitri, I'll take yours first. I mean, thank you for going through the numbers in such detail. The fact is that, you know, once you have to deal with the devolution to the states, you expose a certain amount of revenue expenditure in the central kitty that you have no choice in terms of dealing with. And Professor Sen will agree with that, because, you know, whether it is defense expenditure, whether it's interest expenses, whether it's a host of central institutions and central programs, you just have to spend on that. And the quality of that spending, a lot of it is revenue. Now, that's part of the reason why the revenue deficit is 2.8% and the quality of the fisc is not as good as it can be. And hopefully our view is that as we put the money, that extra little incremental money, into capital expenditure, that then we will get the growth and we'll bring down the revenue deficit. So that's a dynamic view. We had no choice, given the devolution. We were going to expose those high revenue expenditures in the budget, as it were. That was just an inescapable fact of the budget arithmetic. We had no choice in that matter. So that was your question. Let me come back, Doug, to your two questions. One was around the narrow tax base that we have, and then the second one was regarding the infrastructure and how we intend to spend that. Let me address both fully. You're absolutely right to say that India has a very narrow tax base. In fact, if you ask us in the finance ministry what are our two most central concerns, I would say they're twofold. One is job creation and Make in India and everything else associated with job creation. And number two is broadening the tax base. Because at 10% of GDP for central taxes, state plus center is about 15 to 16%. At 10% of GDP for the tax base for India, it's well below that of our peer group, which is Brazil and Indonesia and other large emerging market countries. And we are not even within hailing distance of where the OECD average is, which is around 30%. So we have a really, really narrow tax base. And frankly, because of that narrow tax base, we are in a very compromised position in terms of our ability to be able to operate a modern 21st century state. And most importantly, and this is where the shoe really pinches, is that we cannot put in place an appropriate social security system that can take away hunger and want and deprivation in India. That's where we are really, really falling short. And the spending on the social side, on health and education and all those areas is really, really, really squeezed as a result of that. So increasing our tax base is a very, very important priority for us, and we are spending a lot of time thinking about what we can do. And it's not a question of rates, because our rates now are fairly globally competitive. It's really because our tax base is too small. Too few people are in the tax net. Maybe GST can help us and so on, but we really need to figure out a way to solve that problem.
If you have a point,
lower rates and broaden, just get more people paying.
Yeah,
let me explain. Yeah. If you look at our individual tax
rates, does the 282 give you the elbow room to broaden the tax base as well? Because everybody's talking about that. Amy, you have a question there.
Let me first answer Doug's question. So I haven't had a chance to. So yes, of course we want to do that. But if you look at our individual tax rates, they're 10, 20 and 30%. And how many people do you think are over in the 20% and in the 30%? A minuscule number. So we have a real challenge there, point one. Point two, you talk about infrastructure. As far as infrastructure is concerned, I think we've done very profoundly important things for infrastructure. Not only have we set aside an additional 70,000 crores of spending for infrastructure, we have said that we will let other financing agencies issue tax-free bonds for infrastructure. That will mean more money for an NABARD or an IRFC or a National Housing Board to go into infrastructure. And the third one, which we've not talked about at all, which is hugely important, is the National Investment Trust. Now, I don't know if you have paid attention to this detail, but basically we have said that we will put 20,000 crores per year into the National Investment Trust. And because we are putting 20,000 crores per year, we have the ability to support debt capacity, let's say of 70, 80,000 crores, 100,000 crores a year in the National Investment Trust. That is money that is entirely going to go into infrastructure, and it will enable us to do certain things, for example, like take on stalled projects that don't have capital, where the promoters are just not in a position to put in fresh equity. We can take those over because it will be done as a sovereign thing. We can assume some of those risks, and we can get some of these stalled projects going, which is another very important way of getting the economy moving very quickly in terms of the near term. So those are the ways in which we are thinking about infrastructure. And of course, we've also said we'll corporatize the ports, and of course, right. We've done the coal mine auctions and so on. So there's a whole host of things that we're doing to really start to improve the situation. And I can tell you, when you look at energy, electricity production is at record levels. Now finally our power plants are having coal that they did not have previously. Coal production has gone up in double digits. So a lot of things are changing on the ground.
It's also taking up the cost of economy, and Maitri, you have a question there.
Why not put the entire disinvestment proceeds in that? Because after all, 20,000 crores a year is good, it's better than zero, but we're getting 695,000 in disinvestment. So disinvesting one part of the family silver, you're selling another one part of the family silver, so why not put it into disinvestment?
So our disinvestment target is 69,500 crores. Right. We are saying 20,000 crores a year for the investment trust. So obviously those numbers don't match, and that's because we want to be able to put some of the disinvestment money into the social sector, into other very important areas where we do need to be able to put money to work. And we are saying, okay, let's start with 20,000 crores per year. Let's see how it goes. If it goes well, then we can think of other things as well. But let's do it in a way which is thoughtful, which is deliberative, and let's make sure everything is in place to be able to pull it off. I'll give you the example of the 10,000 crore fund of funds, which we had announced in the previous budget of July. And we are just now at the point where we are getting it operationalized and getting it off the ground. So, you want to do it in a methodical way, which is consistent with what the government actually is able to do in terms of implementation.
Amy, you have a question.
I had a question on the issue of broadening the tax base. I know agriculture is now completely exempt from any kind of taxes. Now, of course, not every farmer is a subsistence farmer living hand to mouth. You actually do have, at this point, some very large, very profitable commercial agriculture. Isn't that an area where you could start to look at people who could maybe be slowly brought into the tax base?
Or is that politically too dangerous to even touch or think upon?
It's a good suggestion. It's a good suggestion. We consider all proposals. We consider those proposals as well.
Agriculture is a state subject, which complicates matters a little bit for the centre.
So then throw out agriculture from the budget. Why have it in there? I mean, that's the other point he has to
No, I was just a bit, one of the things, looking at the budget, the big thing in the budget is that you've been very, very good to the FIIs.
Yeah, that was the other point of discussion.
I think they've got it.
Whatever they wanted.
Almost whatever they wanted. Now, one somewhat suspects that maybe you were worried about what would happen to investments, what would happen to flows, what the reaction of the credit rating agencies were, and this is a way of actually signaling that no, I mean, this is going to be a good place to invest in. So is there something like that?
That's one criticism, and the other criticism I think came in from Maitri saying this budget is skewedly in favor of corporate India and FIIs. You want to expand upon that and let me take both questions
together? More in favor of FIIs than corporate India. Corporate India, you just held out the promise and you said you'll remove exemptions. So if both go hand in hand, I'm fine with that. But as far as FIIs are concerned, I think we're bending backwards. And to be honest, we don't really, at the moment, we don't want so much capital coming in. Ultimately, India must develop from gross domestic savings. Foreign investment can only help at the margin, and if it's in the nature of FDI. But by clubbing FDI and FII, I think we've perhaps gone a little overboard. I don't think we need to attract them so much. We're sufficiently attractive. We don't need to do fair and lovely to get them in.
Unless you're nervous.
They'll come in any way. Where else will they go?
Yeah, was there a certain amount of nervousness while this budget?
Getting investment going, the financing would in a sense follow. I mean,
so, our thinking on this budget was sabka budget, everyone's budget, sabka la, which means it benefits everyone. So everyone's benefited. So whether it is investors, whether it is, the poor and the deprived, whether it is jobs that we are creating for the youth, what we're trying to do for farmers, we have tried to make sure that everybody benefits from the budget. So that has certainly been our approach. Now, with respect to FII specifically, obviously, as Amy has pointed out, we are concerned about what could happen with oil prices and so on. And therefore, it's important to be able to have some contingency and some ways in making sure investment continues to flow and so on. And so this is a good buffer for us to be able to make sure that we are able to handle the current account deficit and so on if the flows keep coming. So we've got to do that, number one. Number two, as far as FII is concerned, you have to remember, we are in a global economy. It's a very competitive economy, and if you look around the world, you look at other advanced economies, whether it's Japan or the US or the UK, or you look at ASEAN countries or the developing world, I mean, we are just on par. It's not that we have bent over backwards to the FIIs. We are handicapped, whether it's tax rates, whether it is, our policies. On the one hand, people are accusing us of red tape and everything else, and then when we try and liberalize it and make it easier for you to, then you say you're bending over backwards. No, we're just trying to be globally competitive. And please understand, as far as the economy is concerned, it's very important for us to be globally competitive so that we can attract investment. And please also understand that investment is not just a question of, foreign investment. We have to be attractive to domestic investors. Today, a Tata Motors can put a plant, a Jaguar plant in America, they can put it in China, they can put it in India. So we have to be attractive to investment of all kinds. Otherwise, we will not be able to create the jobs that come with investment. So we have to be globally competitive, and we have to be innovation driven. And we spent a lot of time in this budget trying to make sure that we are both.
But have you focused a lot on FIIs and not FDIs so much? That's the other criticism, that long-term capital hasn't been sufficiently attracted, whereas the hot, volatile money will, of course, rush in now.
Yeah, absolutely, because FDI has huge externalities. Every country would like to prioritize FDI over FII, whereas we seem to have gone the other way, which is a big difference between India and China. China incentivized FDI. Even now, their stock market is not as open as ours. So perhaps we erred a little bit.
Let me
yeah, please.
I have personally invested tens of millions of dollars as an FII and as an FDI. So I know a little bit about how this works. The fact of the matter is that our Indian companies are extremely competitive and are very good companies in many cases to invest in. That's what attracts the FII. People are happy to give the money to Indian companies, companies like Infosys, companies like Tata Motors, companies like HDFC, Axis Bank. We've got a fabulous group, and no other emerging economy in the world has such an extraordinary set of highly competitive, world-class companies like we do in India. That's what's attracting a lot of the FII, which is terrific. It's brilliant. We should absolutely do that. Now, as far as FDI is concerned, obviously we want FDI, massive externalities, great spillovers, enables us to create competition in India and really good for Indian consumers.
Jobs.
Certainly jobs. All those things are great, and we want FDI. Now, the problem with FDI has been twofold. One has been infrastructure, so people are reluctant to bring factories to India, which we are addressing through infrastructure, which we just discussed. And number two, the ease of doing business in India. It's been terrible. We are 142nd in the world. Who wants to set up a factory in India when our ease of doing business is 142? So therefore, we are tackling the ease of doing business with a war footing. Honorable Prime Minister has said very clearly, we want India to be in the top 50. We are taking this on. We are hacking away at it. And as we hack away at it, FDI money is long term. But the bottlenecks and the issues and the challenges they face are also in some ways quite structural and long term. So while we can bring in the FII through our great companies and so on, wonderful, keep that going. So it's not either or. We also have to do everything we need to do for FDI as well, and we're working on both fronts.
So nobody is going to blame you for the intention to move from 140 to 250. I think a lot of people will question, what has this budget done to ease doing business in India? You want to add to this, Amy?
I have another kind of question, which is the whole idea of the budget is somewhat stimulatory because you're slowing down the pace of fiscal consolidation. You're going to push back the deadline for achieving the 3% fiscal deficit target. And you're doing that in an environment where, according to the new GDP numbers, you're growing at 7.4%. Now, a lot of people are having trouble with the GDP numbers, and this is one of the things also being talked about because the supporting numbers of such as investments, domestic investment has been so weak. Demand hasn't really, it's not clear. I mean, the underlying numbers don't seem to add up to this idea that, wow, gosh, India's economy grew 7.4% last year. I mean, a year ago we were all saying this is was an economy in the doldrums. So now you've come up with these new numbers, and yet you're pursuing a stimulatory budget. Does that mean you don't believe India's really growing as fast as the new numbers suggest? Why the need for this additional stimulus?
At least it's not reflecting on the ground.
So let's ask that question. It's not as if we come up with these numbers. We have an independent central statistical organization that is a very eminent and very competent group of people, and they constantly are fine-tuning and improving their way of calculating GDP, and they had to make a major adjustment, which is go to market prices from factor costs. So that was a major adjustment they had to do, and they had to change the base here. In doing that, they have now come up with these. We had nothing to do with those GDP numbers. They've come up with it independently. So that's what the numbers are. Now we have to deal with it as they are, and many of our most thoughtful economists, whether it is Dr. Rajan at the central bank, whether it is Dr. Arvind Subramaniam, the finance minister, have found it puzzling because the physical ground realities are very different from those high growth rates, right? So therefore, if you talk to business, you talk to consumers, this is not a feel-good time right now, and so therefore the stimulus, particularly in light of the fact that the economy has been starved of investment, makes all the sense in the world, and in effect, when you think of the dynamic aspects of crowding in investment, is the appropriate thing to do.
I'll just put this budget to the equity test, Maithili, and I'll urge Professor Sen to come in here as well. The lack of agri-push is what we had discussed before. 1% is how agriculture is growing. You have 49% people involved in there as far as the professional needs are concerned. Do you think the budget lacks the agri-push to an extent?
To my mind, Mr. Sinha, is a balance between growth and equity. This budget has really pushed very strongly on growth, which is fine, because the earlier government went the other way. But I think equity concerns have somewhat gone to the back. Not only in agriculture, but even in your social security schemes, they're all off budget. Whether you're talking about the new insurance scheme, it's done by the insurance companies. What am I paying my taxes for? The idea of taxes is to lift the poor, who are really poor. So unlike something like Brazil had, your Bolsa Familia, we have nothing remotely. The old age pension is a miserable 200 rupees in most states. Some states, but from the center, some states give, some states don't. But it's really appalling. So I think social security, agriculture, somehow maybe they've been shifted to the back burner in the hope that maybe growth will happen and trickle down will take care of that.
No, so is that I will have to reject what you just said.
Please.
You're fine to have your opinion, but let me just take this on, right? Because it's a very important matter that you're bringing up. The Honorable Prime Minister has been crystal clear. उन्होंने कहा है, मैं हिंदी का प्रयोग करूंगा, कि ये गरीबों की सरकार है और ये सरकार गरीबों को समर्पित है. This is a government of the poor and dedicated to the poor. Absolutely. And I am in 100% agreement with him, because the poor of this country, and there's hundreds and millions of them depending on how you look at it, it is on more, how much, I cannot say with any more vigor and any more dedication than what I'm saying right now. It is our moral responsibility that we make sure that these people are looked after, they're protected, and they get opportunities to improve the dignity and the quality of their life. That is our first and most important priority. There's no question about it. Now, let's ask ourselves, how are we achieving this goal in this budget? And there are 2 or 3 matters here that we need to consider. Number one, go back to the devolution. Many of these matters, the social security programs, whether it's health, whether it's education, whether it's agriculture, are state subjects or concurrent subjects at best. And in fact, the states are best equipped to understand what the needs on the ground are and how best to deliver them. So part one of the equity puzzle is to say, it is constitutionally the responsibility of the states. We are equipping and empowering the states, and as Professor Sen was saying, let's make sure the Niti Aayog and we have sufficient capacity building and training and work and monitoring so that the states can do the job. But let me give you an example. In Gujarat, we have 100% electrification. If we have a one-size-fits-all electrification program, how does that serve Gujarat's priorities? By handicapping them with central schemes. By giving Gujarat that money and letting Gujarat figure out how to deal with the social needs, we are meeting that equity. Point one. There are 3 points. Point one. Point two. Point two is, we, as I said earlier, are not touching subsidies. In fact, we are focusing the subsidies in such a way with targeted beneficiaries and a very streamlined system so that people get the full benefit of the subsidies. I can tell you, I'm elected by the people of this country in Hazaribagh myself. I can tell you, I have gone in village after village after village where people say that there are middlemen, dalali hai, bichholi hai, ye hai. So people are not getting their benefits. By having a direct benefits transfer program, by pushing Jan Dhan Yojana, in 4 months, everybody in this country has a bank account so that we can give them the benefits that they deserve. and that they demand. That's second, which is we are putting the infrastructure in place as rapidly as we can so that our subsidies are targeted and people get what they want. Point 2. Point 3. I think we've thought, despite the fiscal constraints, very innovatively about universal social security, right? So the whole Jan Suraksha idea, which includes Jan Dhan, JAM, where we can target these subsidies, where we have an accident insurance program, we have a life insurance program, and we have pensions, so that a farmer can have a pension now. Our farmer can have a pension. Now, all of us are also fiscally responsible. If we go out and we start printing money, we are going to drive up inflation, and that's going to harm the poor even more. So we have to come up with responsible ways in which people can do this. By having a pension program where we are making a contribution, but we are enabling people to save money, to save for their own retirement, to save for their protection in some ways with support of the government, is in fact the responsible way of doing this. Because the liability that will come to us if we take care of everybody's pension, if we have, even the Social Security program in the US or elsewhere requires contribution. It comes from payroll. Now people are not on payroll.
That, Mr. Sinha. Those who can
so I think if you look at the 3 things I went through, right, the responsibility of the states, number 2, the work on subsidy reform, number 3, what we're trying to do with Social Security, and 4th thing I will say is that there's a lot more to come as well. We are really committed to housing for all. We are going to be working on that. So there's this Jan Suraksha idea, universal social security, this is a very, very important aspect of what this government is doing and is committed to doing, and the Prime Minister is completely focused on that.
Off budget.
I think that's what my point is. Those who can contribute must be made to contribute, but those who cannot, they are the government's responsibility.
You just were attacking us for keeping subsidies at high levels in the budget, and now you're saying it's off budget.
You must target your subsidies. Don't give it to people like me.
I think that's unfair criticism. What we can do in the budget, given fiscal constraints and so on, we do on the budget. What we can do separately off budget with innovative schemes and so on, we will do off budget as well. But look, the commitment to social justice, the commitment to equity, and it has to be for every Indian. This is not something we need to debate. It is a rock solid bedrock principle of the government. Now we can debate how we do it, and I think we've come up with very innovative ways of doing it.
No, I think at the end, I think what we are all interested in is what happens on the ground.
Yes.
And I think how well that happens. And I think there are 3 areas in which people would be concerned. One is health and education. The budget says that we are taking full responsibility. We are not giving up the responsibility we had earlier.
Right.
But the expenditure is down about 25% in nominal terms. Then you have certain other things, which includes, interestingly, water supply and sanitation. It includes the ICDS, where the decrease is about 50%. 50% decline is also happening in agriculture, in what the central government spends. Now, obviously, there is a scope for the states to pick it up. My worry is, on the ground, what will people in India get? Because this is all a fiscal arithmetic, partly forced upon the government by the Finance Commission. But at the end of the day, will they suddenly find that what they were already getting, some of it is not getting there, either because the states are not spending it, or there is this people sort of doing tutu mama between the center and the states.
Are you trusting the states too much with this evolution?
No, and let me give you a single example.
Yes.
And that single example is that when we came, the UPA came along, we found agriculture in public expenditure had fallen from something like 6% of GDP to about 2% of the GDP.
Right.
We had to do something to get it back. What we did was to launch a scheme which was very simple. It was not what was there in the scheme. It is, if you spent more, you got more. Not nothing. It is what you did. And if you didn't spend more than last year in terms of proportions, you didn't get it at all. It actually got us back to about 4 or 5%. States are unwilling to spend on certain things. And there are things which need to be done. And I wanted to know.
I don't agree with you. I don't agree with you, actually, because if you look at the well-run states, and frankly, most of them are the BJP states, right, where you have good chief ministers, you have a good administration, you have corruption-free governance. You go to Gujarat, you go to Madhya Pradesh, you will see.
Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh and Gujarat were doing well on agriculture after 2004. They didn't do well in agriculture before.
And that was
they just took off.
Well, we can get into all of that, but the reality is it has to do with irrigation and it has to do with water, not necessarily what the central government sends. And so I think the states can get things done. And if we further cripple the states.
No, I didn't say cripple.
So no, but we have been by coming up with these rigid, centralized, one-fits-all program. Now we've got to give the states the resources. And let me tell you one very important thing, Professor Sinha, which is the difference between where you are and where I am. I am accountable to the people. If we don't deliver every day, I have 50 phone calls I take from my constituency, from voters saying, deliver this, deliver this, deliver this. And then I go back and I spend days traveling around in my constituency, in village after village after village. And if we don't deliver, we hear it directly back from the people. And so there is that, the beauty of democracy is that accountability. And if we are not able to deliver, we know very clearly in this country, you're out the door. People want their elected representatives to deliver public services and to deliver a better quality of life. That accountability, our democracy has matured. We've seen that in election after election after election. And I can tell you that sense of responsibility, that overriding sense of I have to deliver for the people of my constituency, whether you're an MP, an MLA, or a ward councillor, is absolutely there because we have no choice.
So that's the litmus test that any government of the elected day has to pass. But I have time for quick closing comments, and a quick closing question really has to be the wow factor in the budget.
Yes, what is the wow factor? It's a hugely ambitious and complex budget. But I think coming back to the last question, how will you know what success looks like?
Okay, we'll go across the table and then get him to answer the wow question finally.
I'm so wowed, I don't know what to ask.
The Big Bang reforms, so to say.
No, I don't want Big Bang. I think India is too complex a country. We cannot afford Big Bang.
Are you happy with the incremental?
Yeah, I'm okay with that, but just have one worry, something that still worries me, Mr. Sinha. I remember soon after you got elected, you talked about how one lady in your Hazaribagh constituency, she blessed you and she gave you a flower because she had nothing else to give you. I just worry that this budget does not do enough for her and we're counting too much on trickle-down effect, and I just hope I'm wrong and you're right.
Well, I have no choice but to meet her needs, and I can tell you if I go and meet her again, I will assure her that with the Atal Pension Yojana, with the Jan Suraksha programs that we have, we will in fact, and by the way, as Gandhiji said, you have to have that talisman. She is my talisman.
But she doesn't have 12 rupees for that insurance.
12 rupees,
she has only a flower.
She has only a flower, but we have other benefits which through the Jan Dhan Yojana, she gets the Vridha pension, and in fact, when she met with me, her request was, make sure I get my Vridha pension. With Jan Dhan Yojana, we can get her the Vridha pension. In fact, in Jharkhand, after our government was put in place, we went into every village and we ran camps and we said, if you have not signed up through Jan Dhan to get direct benefits, direct pension into your bank account, please do it now. So we made sure that was virtually the first thing that our government did in Jharkhand, because I was feeling, that it's very important for us to
surely, to be honest, you must say that there is something that isn't there and you wanted it to be there.
Okay, let's
What's that? I mean, what is that you're going to add in the next budget?
The next budget and also the wow factor, yes, Amy.
What is the wow factor for the urban, middle and lower middle class, many of whom aren't targeted by all these grand schemes which are very focused on rural areas and who mostly look at the budget and say, gee, our restaurant meal or our visit to the doctor has just gotten more expensive because you've raised the service tax on
that. So that's the wow factor on the urban middle class. This is the one thing that you would want to do in the next budget that was missing in this one. Quick closing answer on
No, there's a very simple answer. There's so many vows, I don't know where to start, but we just had we talked about, the cooperative federalism and so on, but we just had a vow yesterday. Interest rates are cut and they will, hopefully the rate cycle will continue to go down, and that urban middle class person will have more cash in their pocket because the EMIs for their housing loan, their car loan, all of that is coming down because we have pursued prudent fiscal consolidation. That's the vow for them, is the lowering of interest rates which are coming their way now.
Is 25 basis points enough though?
No, but we have to, obviously this is data driven and we have to see over time what happens, and this is an appropriate and prudent manner in which we have to go, and we will go that way. So I think that for
and
sure.
The one miss which lacks in your mind somewhere.
No,
and
there is, I'll tell you what it is. It is that as far as the pension programs are concerned, for that old lady, I wish we could do more. I wish for the people, whether they're they've really, whether they are disabled or whether they are over 65, we could do more in terms of putting more money in their pockets, making sure that every single person in India is able to get at least 1,000, 2,000 rupees a month that is in those very, very vulnerable groups. Thankfully, we now have the way to reach them through the Jan Dhan Yojana and through Aadhaar. Now we have to make sure in the next budget and going forward that we can actually get the money into their hands, and so they feel like they've got a safety net. That is really, really the very important thing. And I will leave you all with this final thought. The really most important aspect of this budget, leaving aside cooperative federalism, for somebody like me, is the universal social security. As I said, this is ye garibon ki sarkar hai. This is a government for the poor. If we can get them an efficient way of getting universal social security into their hands, so their lives are protected, that they can live lives of dignity, we would have done the best service that we can for this country.
So as we wrap this debate, we just certainly hope that after the budget next year, we will not be doing a budget bash-up, but a budget mash-up. But thanks each one of you for being with us. Thank you, Mr. Sinha, for joining us and explaining this budget, taking on the tough questions, and we hope some of you go home convinced. With that, it's a wrap on budget bash-up. Some of the toughest questions put forward to the union government as far as this budget is concerned. The union government has defended all along, this is a budget for Achhe Din. We do hope they arrive soon.